Okay, just for a second, picture your kitchen, your pantry, your fridge. You've probably got, what, dozens of different brands in there, right? But what if I told you that a huge number of them, maybe more than you think, all trace back to one single gigantic company? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the corporate giant that's kind of hiding in plain sight in all of our kitchens. So check this out, 8,000. Just let that number sink in for a minute. It tells a massive story about power, about influence, and yeah, about the food we eat every single day. Any ideas what this could possibly be?
You got it. That is the approximate number of brands owned by Nestlé, the largest food company in the world. We're talking nearly 8,000 different brands. Everything from your pet's food, to your morning coffee, to candy, to baby formula. It's what people call the illusion of choice. You see dozens of options on the shelf, but at the end of the day, the profits often flow back to just a handful of massive corporations. But the story of Nestlé's scale isn't just about how many brands it owns, it's also about its global impact. And that's been a source of some serious controversy for decades.
All right, so to really get a handle on the company's full impact today, we actually have to go back in time. Because this isn't new. There's a long, and I mean long, recurring pattern of controversy here.
And look, this isn't about just one bad thing that happened one time. The criticisms against Nestlé, they span decades and continents. You go back to the 70s, and it was all about this aggressive marketing of baby formula. We'll get back to that in a second. Then in the 2000s, you've got serious allegations of child and even slave labor in its cocoa supply chain. Fast forward to the 2010s, there were huge food safety scandals. And now today, the company is under a microscope for things like water rights and plastic pollution. It's this pattern that's really key to understanding what's going on right now.
And the severity of these early criticisms, it's a really crucial point. That baby formula scandal back in the 70s was so damaging that according to the sources we're looking at, it literally earned the company the label baby killer from its critics. I mean, that led to one of the most famous consumer boycotts in history. This idea of prioritizing profit over public health, it provides some really important context for the controversies that are still happening today, especially when it comes to one of the most vital resources on the planet, water.
And that right there brings us to the heart of what we're talking about today, the global fight over water and Nestlé's role in what some see as the transformation of a fundamental human right into just another product to be sold. This really gets to the core of the whole conflict. On one hand, you've got the United Nations, which in 2010 officially recognized safe drinking water as a fundamental human right, period. But on the other hand, you have the business model of bottled water, which critics say does the exact opposite. They argue it privatizes that same public resource, turning it into a commodity, something to be sold for profit.
And listen to this. This is a pretty powerful quote from Maud Barlow, who's a former top UN advisor on water. She says, when a company like Nestlé comes along and says, pure life is the answer, that's more than irresponsible. That's practically a criminal act.
Wow.
That really captures the outrage a lot of activists feel, right? The argument is that selling bottled water as the solution, especially in places where public water systems are failing, isn't just irresponsible, it's exploitative.
But hey, this isn't just some abstract theoretical debate. This conflict has very real, on-the-ground consequences for communities all over the world. So let's dive into some specific case studies to see exactly how this plays out.
Okay, so let's start in North America, where Nestlé's water bottling operations have faced some really fierce opposition. In places like California and Canada, critics and local communities were linking the company's water extraction to wells drying up and serious damage to local ecosystems. The resistance from Indigenous communities was especially strong, and their collective action was a huge factor that ultimately led to Nestlé exiting the bottled water business in Canada entirely in 2024. A huge deal.
But maybe the most explosive situation of all was in Michigan. And the timing here, it's just critical. At the exact same time that the residents of Flint were suffering through a devastating lead contamination crisis, literally couldn't drink their own tap water, the state of Michigan approved a request from Nestlé to increase the amount of fresh water it could pump from a source right nearby. Think about that.
And the public anger in Michigan was just fueled by numbers like these. For an annual permit fee of just $200, the company was allowed to pump up to 400 gallons of water per minute. That image of a massive corporation making huge profits from a public resource, while a community just down the road was being poisoned by its public water, well, it became this incredibly powerful symbol of injustice.
And this is not just a North American thing.
Let's hop across the Atlantic to France, where Nestlé is facing a criminal investigation. Get this, the company has actually admitted to using purification methods like UV and carbon filters on its natural mineral water brands, methods that are straight up illegal under French law for that specific label. And what's maybe even more troubling, a French Senate report has accused the government itself of knowing about these illegal practices for years and covering it all up.
And the health risks here became terrifyingly real. After they discovered fecal bacteria in one of their wells, Nestlé was forced to destroy 2 million bottles of its famous Perrier brand. 2 million.
But the controversy doesn't just stop at the source of the water. There's another huge environmental impact we have to talk about. What happens after the water is gone? Yeah, we're talking about the millions upon millions of plastic bottles that are left behind. So, research into bottled water has uncovered a pretty widespread problem. One major study found that a staggering 93% of all bottled water samples they tested, and this was across a bunch of different brands, contained microplastics. And in that very same study, one brand stood out for having the highest concentration of microplastics. A single liter of Nestlé Pure Life was found to contain more than 10,000 microplastic particles. 10,000 in one bottle.
So, okay, when you put all these pieces together, the fights over water extraction, the contamination scandals, the plastic pollution, it really forces us to ask some pretty fundamental questions about the whole business model of bottled water.
This table from the International Baby Food Action Network, or IBFAN, it really breaks down the core of the business model. What they point out is that some bottled water goes through disinfection treatments that are pretty similar to what your municipal tap water goes through. The key difference? It's then sold for anywhere from 100 to 400 times the cost. Let that sink in.
So the central argument from critics really boils down to this. Consumers are paying this massive premium for a feel-good, idealized brand, something called Pure Life, when in some cases, the product they're actually buying might be less regulated and even more contaminated with microplastics than the water that comes right out of their tap for a fraction of the price. So in response to all of this, advocacy groups like IBFN, who've been monitoring Nestlé for decades, they've made some very specific calls to action. They cite what they call a recurring pattern of putting profits ahead of public health and the environment, and they're calling on consumers and institutions to refuse sponsorships and to join their long-running boycott of Nestlé products. And that leaves all of us with this one final question to think about. When a resource that is absolutely essential for all life is taken from the public, bottled up, and then sold back to us for a profit, what is the true cost? And I don't just mean the price on the bottle. I mean the cost to our communities, the cost to the environment, and maybe the cost to the very idea of a shared public good.